Hey guys! Well, last week's chapter was a tough one, and today it isn't any easier, but this was part of Sarah's story. I have to say that after I read this, the first time I read this book, I remember every time I would hear in the news of someone drowning in the Jordan River or just finding a body in the Jordan River, which seems to happen a lot. I always think back to Will. So I decided to do a little bit of research on the Jordan River. Now, the temple that I grew up with was the Jordan River Temple. That was our temple. And I always thought that interesting because the Jordan River here in Utah has always had this negative reputation. I thought it interesting that this beautiful temple is named after this dirty river. So I wanted to do some research on the river, and so real quick, just for fun, here's what I discovered. Although the Jordan River was originally a cold water fishery with 13 native species, including Bonneville cutthroat trout, it has become a warm water fishery where the common carp is most abundant. It was heavily polluted for many years by raw sewage, agricultural runoff, and mining waste. So for 100 years, raw, untreated sewage was dumped into the river, and also farming and animal runoff occurred as well. And mining operations led to 40 smelters being built and contaminating the river with heavy metals, mostly arsenic and lead. During the construction of the Salt Lake Temple, granite blocks were floated down the river to the city. The Jordan was again used to float construction materials in 1869, this time floating logs and ties for the use of the Central Railroad. Once the home of bighorn sheep and beaver, the contemporary river is frequented by raccoons, red foxes, and domestic pets. In the 1960s, sewage treatment removed many pollutants, and since those efforts to clean up the water, the river is now used for canoeing. I don't know that anybody fishes in it, but there are trails and parks along the river, and people do canoe in it. It is an important avian resource visited by more than 200 bird species. And here's how the river got its name. The river was named the Western Jordan in 1847 by Heber C. Kimball, soon after his arrival in Utah. He noted its resemblance to the Middle Eastern river of the same name, a river flowing from a freshwater lake through fertile valleys to a dead sea. Western was soon dropped from its name, and it just became the Jordan River. Today in Sacrament, a counselor in the bishopric was doing announcements, and he mentioned an article on KSL this week of a body that was found in the Jordan River who happened to share the same name as someone in our ward, and he said, don't worry, it's not the same person, even though he's not here today. That wasn't him. And it had me thinking today as I was reading this chapter, I wonder how many bodies are typically found in the Jordan River. And this video popped up. I'll have a link down below in the video description if you're curious. But last year, there were 42 bodies found in the Jordan River within a 6-month window. It's believed that a lot of these bodies are of homeless people who have been murdered. So apparently that's a whole other issue. I'm not sure what's become of that, if there's an investigation going on, but it looks like there was a video made about it a year ago, and I really haven't heard anything else. So, not to veer off track, but that just goes to show why this river has sort of had this ominous history and not a very positive reputation. This was the river that took Will's life. It's kind of crazy. Anyways, having said all of that, let's get into today's chapter. Chapter 14. Next morning, the sun shone on the naked figure of a man lying near the river's edge. As its gentle warmth penetrated his cold, stiffened limbs, he opened his eyes to look up into the deep blue infinity above. As memory flooded back upon him, he sat up painfully, turning in a semicircle from side to side, scanning every inch of the landscape within range. There were the horses up near the spot where they'd been put to graze the night before. But there was no other human being in sight, in either direction. Then it was true. The whirlpool had taken Will. Will, excellent swimmer, perfect health, Will, his brother, husband to Sarah. Will was gone. Dead! The sky, the horses, the river, all there as before. But Will was gone, never to return. Gone out of his life, out of Sarah's life. Was it fate? Or had fate been helped? He shut his eyes to shut out the glare of the rising sun and pressed his hand over them. Was he responsible? Did he? He fell back onto the sand. Sarah dozed through the late afternoon. Once she rose, she put the loaves of bread into the stone crock. Deciding against supper alone, she returned to the bed and lay down without removing her clothes. She was very tired. The long walk into town, then seeing Will, only to have him snatched away the next moment, was more than she could bear. She watched the darkness fill up the room, first the far corners, leaving only the windows visible. She could not sleep, but gradually a semi-consciousness descended upon her. As she lay there, thus, a strangulating cry rang suddenly into her subconsciousness. God, save me for Sarah. She struggled to her feet and staggered to the door, one hand outstretched in the darkness, the other pressed to her quivering mouth. She jerked the door open and sank in a heap onto the cold stone step. Presently, she straightened herself to a sitting position with elbows on knees and chin resting in her hands. Thus she watched as the slow minutes dragged themselves into hours. The night wore slowly away. The dream she had the night of the dance came back to her in all its ominous foreboding. Then it was as though Will spoke gently in her ear. If you get lonesome, look in the Bible. A note. Somehow she dragged herself back into the house and lit the lamp. She was aware of the stiffness and shooting pains throughout her body as she took down the Bible from the shelf. A white envelope slipped between the pages and fell into her lap. Placing the open book on the table, she picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. It was unsealed with Sarah written in immaculate English script across the front. So like Will, so like everything he did or said. No bluster, no pretense, just genuine sincerity, as though some part of his spirit reached out and caressed her own. She drew out the folded page and read the 10 words that formed the message. Wait for me until tomorrow, sweetheart. Over and over she read the message, especially the last signature beneath. Forever your own Will. Yes, Will, she whispered. I'll wait for you. I'll wait for you forever and ever if I must. But please, please don't let it be too long. She bowed her head on the open book and prayed. Dear God, whatever's happened to him, don't let it be too long. Please bring him back to me soon, please. Finally, she sat up to replace the envelope, whose message was now a part of herself. As she gazed down at the book, an inked-in passage caught her eye. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. She glanced up at the top of the page. That too was marked, Matthew 6. A pang like the tolling of a bell sounded in her heart. That had been her father's motto. Never had he defied God's will. Rather, he had sought all the days of his life to obey it. And he, her beloved father, had met with sudden and violent death. Was that God's will? And now was it to be his will to take her will from her as he had her father? Rising from her chair and raising her clenched hands above her head, she cried aloud, No, no! Will, wherever you are, come back to me. Come back. She paced back and forth the length of the room until her feet and legs could no longer support her body. The sun had already topped the rim of the mountain when she dragged herself out and sat down once more on the step to wait. To wait for she knew not what, yet wait she must. That was all there was left for her to do. What seemed like eons later, she saw him coming toward her, stumbling up the road. She knew it was Charles, though he walked like a man in a trance. His figure blurred before her tired eyes as he moved, his arms dangling at his sides with a bundle pushed up under one arm. He saw her and paused, though neither greeted the other. As he hesitated, a fire sprang to life behind her glazed eyes as they washed over him with searching intensity. He did not meet her look, yet his soul felt seared by it. He remembered forever that pitiful, forlorn figure crouched there before him. "He's dead. Your will is dead." The words fell like blackened cinders through the grate of the fireplace. A terrible, suffocating sound cut its way through his consciousness. Like one possessed, he sprang past her into the room and threw the bundle onto the cot, where it landed with a queer thud. He turned and shot past her crouched figure onto the road, stumbling over his own feet in his hate to escape the sight of her suffering. Somehow he reached the cabin of Mrs. Moore. There he blurted out that Will had been drowned in the Jordan River the previous night, and that Sarah knew. Then he collapsed completely. "He's a sick man, Mary Alice," exclaimed the widow to the terrified girl. He had slumped down into the chair near the table, his head falling forward onto his chest, eyes glazed and feet sprawled out in front of him like posts. Mrs. Moore caught up his arm and felt for his pulse. "Get the cot ready. We must put him to bed. He's running a temperature. His pulse is very rapid." The girl obeyed automatically, though she had never been nearer fainting than at that moment. "Soon as we can get him settled, I must go to Sarah. Are you up to staying here with him? You must not be frightened. Remember, you are almost a nurse. This is your chance to prove yourself." All the time she was speaking, she worked over the prostrate figure, removing shirts, boots, and clothing. The girl drew strength from her calm. They soon had their patient comfortably tucked into the little cot in the far corner of the room. "There, now if he comes to before I get back, try to get a little hot milk, or perhaps tea. In his case, down him. It might be well to keep a cold, wet cloth on his forehead. I'll go by Louisa's and tell them, and they can go for Martha and the bishop." Coming close to the girl and placing a hand on either shoulder, "Are you going to be all right? Can I leave you in charge here?" "Yes, I'll be fine," she replied, looking to the widow in the eye. "Go to Sarah. She needs you. I'll take care of Charles." As she spoke, there was a coughing sound from the sick man, followed by unintelligible mutterings. "It's the fever," explained the widow. "He's delirious. Keep changing the cold cloth. He'll quiet down presently and go off to sleep. I'll send someone to help you as soon as I can." Then she was off. Uncle William and Aunt Louisa were still at the table, though it was almost 2 hours past noon. They had eaten late and lingered over their meal. "What is it?" they chorused in unison. She told them what had happened, ending with, "Martha must be told, and the bishop notified at once. Sarah has been alone too long as it is. I'll go there now, and please one of you go to Mary Alice when you can. She's upset and all alone with Charles." Sarah was sitting where Charles had left her, a queer mound on the step, knees drawn up beneath her chin, dress draped around her like a wigwam. Her head was bowed into her cupped hands, eyes closed. She did not see the approaching figure. Discovering her from a distance, the widow made mental comment. "She's taking it in the worst way, all bottled up in that proud heart of hers. Dear God," she prayed, "help me to help her." She hesitated beside the bowed figure, then sat down beside her and gathered her into her arms. "Sarah, Sarah, I've come to help you, to be with you," she whispered as she rocked gently back and forth. There was no response, except a tremor running through the girl's body. She spoke again. "Come, we must go inside," as she half lifted, half dragged her to her feet and into the cabin. She put her to bed and bathed her hands and face. Sarah seemed in a kind of stupor, only half realizing what was happening. Now and then her eyes opened, and she looked at her friend, neither helping nor resisting her. The widow brushed and braided the tangled hair, neglected until now. Then came Sarah's first words. "It was the river. I know it was the river. Tell me everything." "Yes, it was the river, but that's all I know. Charles collapsed as he was telling us. Mary Alice and myself. The door opened softly, and Martha entered with Carrie, followed by Aunt Louisa. They stood silently at the foot of the bed, looking down at Sarah. Her eyes looked wearily back at them, and then closed. Her mother came close to the bedside and dropped on her knees, clasped both Sarah's hands in her own. "Oh, Sarah," she sobbed, "it can't be true. It can't be true." Again that strange voice that was not Sarah's but came from her lips. It was the river. Several others had arrived, among them the bishop. They stood hesitant in the background, wanting to help, yet helpless. Aunt Louisa gathered up the corner of her white apron and wiped the tears that were trickling down her cheeks. Mrs. Moore drew Martha to her feet. "You'll only upset her more if you give way. Come, let's all step outside where we can talk." She led the way, closing the door behind her. Turning to the bishop, she said, "Sarah is in no condition to talk, and knows nothing of the particulars. Charles is at my house, too ill from exposure to be of any assistance. But we must send men to recover the body without delay. Don't you agree? If you'll take over here, I'll see to it at once. Can you tell me approximately where the tragedy occurred?" "A little this side of Black Rock. It's very near there, I'm sure." "We'll find it." It took 4 endless days of searching before Will's body was found and recovered. The bishop called for volunteers, and 6 men responded. They left within the hour, equipped with dragnets and ropes, and worked until dark. This went on until the 4th morning without success. On the 3rd day, they used dynamite. Still nothing. On the afternoon of the 4th day, they employed 2 huge grapnels, 5-pronged hook-like anchors. These were attached to heavy ropes, extending one on either side of the river bank, and were pulled upstream through the quicksand by 3 horses yoked together on either side. It was then they found the body, torn as it were from the resentful bowels of slinking, twisting, circular currents. They lifted it from the clutches of the curling iron throngs, gently pressed the torn scalp back over the exposed skull. The face, though bloated and purple, was still recognizable. The other wounds left by the hooks were in the back and thighs, and would be hidden when clothed for burial. "Strange he should be wearing all his clothes," remarked one man. "Someone said he jumped in to save his brother. Seems funny, somehow. They say both were excellent swimmers. No one could swim with boots on. And the quicksand, that's what got 'em all right." And that's it for today's chapter. The only positive way to look at this chapter is that at least they found Will's body so they could have a proper burial. But other than that, there's absolutely nothing positive about this part of Elizabeth's story. Next week, we're going to read all about the funeral, and at that point, I do have a surprise I was going to save for the documentary, but I think I'm going to share it in next week's video. So look forward to that, and stay tuned for Chapter 15.